Welcome to Filling You In, a dental podcast with A Squared, where dentist entrepreneurs and spouses, Dr. Anushka Gaglani and Dr. Abhishek Nagaraj, welcome industry experts and innovators to explore trends in business practices, patient care, career development, and what it takes to be successful in dentistry.
Welcome to another episode of Filling You In. I'm Dr. Anushka Gaglani.
I'm Dr. Abhishek Nagaraj.
Today's episode is about what it really looks like to operate a company with your spouse as your executive partner. This is not a personal conversation. It's a governance and operating model conversation. When two people share both a household and a company, clarity around roles, systems, and decision rights becomes even more important. So today, we're going to talk with you about how we've structured our executive partnership, how we use complementary skill sets, and how we manage disagreement in a way that protects the organization.
And what we want to emphasize is that this is less about personality and more about design. If the operating model between two leaders isn't clear, that ambiguity will cascade through the rest of the company. So we've approached this the same way we would approach any executive partnership, with defined ownership, escalation paths, accountability, roles.
Yeah, so if you are in business with your spouse or partner, or you're thinking about it, this is the episode to listen to. So step one is figuring out what role clarity is. That's foundational, right? The first principle we learned is that shared responsibility without defined ownership creates friction. Early on, at our first practice, we both were kind of involved in most decisions, which felt collaborative. But in practice, we started to create overlap, rework, and confusion for our teams about where final decisions actually came from. Interestingly enough, though, because our skills are complementary, we kind of created a natural groove around who was going to manage what. We just hadn't solidified it into an actual structure.
We were deferring to our skill sets and strengths, but we just hadn't realized that that's what we were doing. Ambiguity at the top always shows up further down the organization, right? If leaders aren't clear on who owns what, teams will hesitate, decisions slow down, accountability weakens. So we made a pretty deliberate shift towards explicit decision rights instead of informal alignment.
Yeah, and one thing that I remember would happen, Abhishek, I don't know if you remember this, but we would have team members. It was kind of like mom and dad, right? They would ask you something. If you said no, they would come to me to say yes. So we really had to put a stop to that right away.
I remember that.
How we did this, in 2020, in the height of COVID, I remember you'd read Get a Grip. And we introduced EOS as the operating framework. For anyone who hasn't heard of EOS, it's Entrepreneur Operating System. At its core, EOS is built around a simple but powerful idea, which is that every major role and function has a single end-to-end owner. That doesn't mean that other people can't be involved in it, but one person owns the entire result and the process beginning to end. It's not a shared lane. There's only one accountable leader.
Yeah, one person in one seat is such a powerful concept. That concept alone changed how we work together. Instead of asking who should weigh in, we started asking who owns this outcome. It forced us to make our decision structure very visible and not just understood.
Yeah, and using EOS, we kind of mapped out the organization with an accountability chart in terms of functions, not personalities, which really made it easier for us to identify where each of us adds the most value.
It also removed a lot of emotion from the conversation. We weren't deciding who does what based on preference or history, right? We were deciding based on accountability and outcomes.
Yeah, and for us, that meant defining real operating lanes, not just executive titles, right? One of the things I believe, yes, titles to some extent are important to some people, but that's not actually where results happen. Titles are, again, just a title at the end of the day. So I own the system side of the organization, right? Operations, leadership, infrastructure, clinical and operational standards, and how workflow actually flows through the company. And of course, I have the operations team complement me with that. That includes how leaders are trained, how the doctors are trained, how performance is reviewed, and how decisions get translated into day-to-day execution.
And I own the financial side and the risk side of things, including some recruiting and hiring of our leadership teams, capital strategy, financial performance, compliance, exposure, governance. My focus is more on how decisions today will affect the company in the long-term horizon, What does that long-term stability from a financial perspective look like? What's the downside protection measures we need to have? And ability to just allocate capital effectively and put money into the right investing buckets.
Yeah, and so how does the split improve decision quality? I think it comes down to, when I'm designing a new system or leadership process, my question usually to myself is, I'm not worried about whether it's going to work now. I'm worried about whether it's going to work at scale. Of course, I fully keep in mind that at 8 practices, it's going to be very different than at 100 practices, right? But when I say scale, is this going to work when we're double the size that we are right now? Will this be usable by people running it day to day, not just by leadership? Again, at the end of the day, it's the people at the practices that have to deal with this. So we don't want to bottleneck them and create systems that are more difficult for them.
Yes. And Anushka, you're actually really good at simplifying complex things. And I always have it in my mind, but you just have a way of simplifying things for other people. And that's the counterbalance here, right? And my counterbalance to that, to what Anushka can do, is often, what risk does this introduce? What does this do to the financial model? How does this affect our exposure, capital requirements, compliance posture? That tension is a healthy tension that improves the quality of the final decision. Not that I'm all doom and gloom, but it's just we have to keep thinking about the long-term horizon.
Yeah, and you're actually quite the opposite. I would say you're very much an optimist. So we've come to treat our differences as kind of a governance mechanism. It's funny. We talked about earlier when we had our first practice, things would overlap, but then we kind of naturally found our groove and what we kind of gravitated towards. And a few years ago, we did the Kolbe personality test, which measures the CONUS side of the brain, which is how you kind of behave under pressure. And we realized, we're literally exact complements. So I think putting that on paper really helped. And the systems lens and the risk financial lens naturally kind of stress test each other.
Yes. Just discovering each other's why we operate the way we do under pressure was super helpful. And we were able to solidify that as a system. And we eventually started rolling out Kolbe personality tests for other people, right? Because you want to know how your team can complement you now. Instead of relying purely on like a formal committee or a board to challenge decisions, we've embedded that challenge into the executive partnership itself. That keeps decisions from being one-dimensional and stagnant.
Yeah, and I think kind of, again, going back to the first practice, even the second practice, where we were fully just dentists, right? We were kind of owner-operators. I think we had to kind of figure out how to transition from operator to executive owner. It was easy to kind of just be in the chair and say, we're making money, we're good. But as we started adding complexity, practices, doctors, practice leaders, one of the biggest shifts for me was moving from solving individual problems to designing systems that prevent those problems at scale. Again, how do these problems get taken care of when we're not in the room, when we're not right next to our team? And that meant stepping back from day-to-day operations and focusing more on leadership pipelines, the training, and the standards that allow the organization to function without constant executive intervention, without us constantly having to be part of every decision.
Yeah, and for me, it meant being ambitious and impatient to becoming ambitious and patient. Yeah, I know those two sound kind of contradictory, but it's true. It meant moving from a near-term focus on performance to a longer-term focus on capital efficiency, return on assets, downside scenarios, how expansion decisions affect the company's overall risk profile. Are people actually growing the way we said they were going to grow? A lot of financial alignment, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that really helped us figure out how our roles would evolve over time. In the early days, I think I was deeply involved in operational execution. And over time, as we've gotten amazing team members who have been able to help us kind of execute, my role evolved into kind of building the operational architecture, how accountability is tracked, how priorities move through the organization. I think kind of helping our operational leaders within the organization learn how to prioritize themselves, because there's always something. There's always going to be something broken when you're in an organization. It doesn't matter how small you are, how big you are, how wonderful you are. There's always going to be something on fire.
Absolutely. And my role, I think, evolved from managing immediate financial results to just building long-term financial governance frameworks. How much cash do we need, operating cash do we need to leave in the bank? things, capital structure, just oversight of compliance, strategic risk management, working with lending relationships. So it's interesting how it's evolved.
Yeah, so let's move a little into how we manage disagreement structurally, right? I think disagreement, well, first of all, let me say that we are pretty aligned on almost everything. So that really makes it easier. I think if you are going to think about being in business with your partner, it's important to realize that, if you're completely different, it is going to be more of a struggle. For us, our end goal is the same. So it kind of, it's the day-to-day that we kind of have to align on. But other than that, we're kind of pretty aligned on where we're going. So disagreement is built into the operating model, right? No matter how aligned you are, there's always going to be some level of disagreement about some things. We don't treat it as an exception. We treat it as part of governance.
Yeah, and not all disagreement is bad, right? And I think we have to probably avoid labels as being a good thing or a bad thing. Disagreement is just part of the governance structure that you just spoke about. And that means disagreement should really be framed around criteria and not positions. Yeah. Certainly not around ego. And what risk thresholds are we comfortable with? What return profile are we targeting? What's the return on asset that we want? What level of operational complexity are we willing to absorb? What level of financial downside are we willing to take on this for the upside that we want to capture? I think those are things when we align on those things, I think kind of disagreement starts to fade into the background. Wouldn't you agree?
I completely agree with that. And, kind of also separating issues from individuals. One of the most important principles we follow, and this goes generally, it's not just with us, it's separating the issue from the individual. We're evaluating systems, assumptions, and trade-off, not intent or competence, right? We want to clarify whether if somebody does something, was it intentional, like was it malicious, or was it just ignorance? And I don't mean ignorance in a bad way. I mean, maybe they just didn't know.
Right. And, that keeps discussions analytical and makes it easier to revisit decisions later without attaching them to personal wins, losses, emotions. He said, she said.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk a little bit about boundaries between home and work, right? When your executive partner is also your spouse, the risk is that operational and financial problem solving can expand to all available time. There were a lot of days where I remember we'd come back from a long day of practicing. We'd leave for work at 8 a.m. We wouldn't get back many, many days, I remember, until 8:30, 9 p.m. after a long day of seeing patients. And then we still had to kind of deal with the business things, right? So we would sit on the couch, have no time to do anything. We would sit and talk to each other. And I realized that was really kind of creeping into our personal time. 100%. All we were talking about all the time was business. Not that we don't do that a lot still, but it was kind of becoming very unhealthy. So it's not sustainable long-term for decision quality or leadership effectiveness to always have your head in the business.
Yeah, when you love something deeply, the boundaries can get blurred pretty quickly because then that's all you're ever talking about. And forget that there is a marriage component to this where, there's other things just aside from business too. So we created boundaries around when detailed operational and financial discussions happen or when decisions are going to get made. I think this is key, not to avoid them, just to make sure that they happen in a more structured environment where we are both present and not mentally tired, where they can be documented, evaluated, resolved, and then an actions item or a to-do is actually undertaken from there.
Yeah, I think the last thing, I don't know if other people can relate, but I'm an early bird. The last thing I want to do at 10 p.m. is talk about a new system that we're going to put in place, because the next morning I will say I have no idea what we talked about. So, a boundary we had to institute. So one boundary we instituted was limiting in-depth system design and operational reviews to scheduled leadership sessions. Even we have our once a week L10, again, an EOS meeting, rather than just random ad hoc discussions.
Yeah, ad hoc discussions don't work. And I think that's the recipe for major disagreements, right? That forces, just having structured sessions forces issues into pretty much a framework. And then they actually get prioritized. They get tracked, closed, instead of being solved in fragments across different contexts and then trying to stitch them together can be pretty messy.
Yeah, completely agree. But I have to say something really positive about working with your spouse, running a business with your spouse. And a major advantage is alignment speed, because you spend so much time together, you know how each other thinks, and because operating and risk financial lenses are always present at the top, these decisions are stress tested pretty quickly, right? We again, knowing how each other thinks, we kind of move forward pretty quickly with making decisions, and decisions that are very heavy, that are going to affect the long term of the practices as they scale. For those, we kind of take a little more time, but I think just generally it is a little bit easier when you know your spouse at a deep level.
Spot on. And I think that reduces rework or friction, because now that prevents unraveling from a bad decision you made because you and your spouse were not in alignment with each other. I think fewer decisions get reversed later because they were evaluated for both, scalability and downside from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one structural downside, and we've kind of faced this, is if a leader, within the organization, they might think that, the two of you make decisions together. And I think my answer to that is, you might get that in your business as well. My answer to that is, of course, we're spouses, so we're kind of aligned in life as well as in the business. But we have to be careful not to have that leader feel disempowered, while also having them understand, at the end of the day, the risk is on us, and we're going to be aligned in how to manage that risk.
Yeah, and another one that comes to mind, Anushka, is imbalance, right? If one lane becomes just overloaded, the partnership can become a bottleneck instead of a multiplier. So you and I actually constantly have to recalibrate to make sure we're in balance, letting the teams not overpower them with our decisions as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's super important, is allowing them to have a voice. Again, I think at the end of the day, we want our teams to understand you have a voice. You don't necessarily get a vote, right? The end vote comes from us, but we are very, very open to the opinion, as long as it's brought to us in a respectful manner. I think at the end of the day, we've kind of designed the partnership as its own operating system. We treat it as a system that needs regular review, right? Every year we go back to our accountability chart on EOS. We look at roles, decision rights, escalation paths, and performance expectations, and we hold each other accountable to roles within the business. When we own a seat, we have to be accountable to that seat.
Absolutely. And, being able to just call each other out gently, respectfully, should be okay, where egos don't kick in. I think because the way the top of the organization operates honestly becomes the template for how the rest of the organization operates. So the rest of the organization needs to see that there can be healthy disagreement and there can be healthy conflict, even between the two executive partners who are spouses. And they need to be able to see how that gets resolved so they can take that and do that with other team members as well.
Yeah, and I think that keyword, I like that you said that. The keyword is healthy, right? Healthy disagreement. This is not just disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing, or like you said, letting ego kick in. It's what is best for the greater good of the organization. What decisions are we making? Because the organization is a living, breathing entity that has lots of people that depend on it for their income, right? When we own an organization or any kind of business, really, we're responsible for all of these livelihoods, not just of our employees, but their families too. So it's important to really look at the business from that perspective and treat it as professionals. So, long-term, when we evaluate long-term decisions, I kind of look at whether our operating systems can absorb more complexity without breaking. And really, if I can kind of define my role, that would be the number one thing that I do.
Yeah, and I look at whether our financial structure and risk posture can absorb more scale without increasing fragility of the business. And what are some other markets that we can go into in terms of M&A work or de novo work, or what total addressable markets are. That's predominantly what I do.
So, at the end of the day, I think working with your spouse, there's no one, as long as you were aligned from the beginning, there's no one that's going to be more aligned with you, right? That all comes down to, though, making the right decision in a partner. I would not do this if there were any questioning about whether that's the right partner. That much I can tell you. And if there's one takeaway from this episode, it's that working together at the executive level requires more structure, not less. It requires not allowing egos to get in the way. It requires understanding that this is a business. And so when you're two executives, you can't come in and behave as spouses that make people uncomfortable. One of the things that I always find quite amusing is a lot of people come into the business and they have no idea that we're married. They find out a year later. We've had people come to us and say, I didn't know you guys were married. And that to me is a success, because that means that we are treating this as two actual partners would be, and not two married people. You know, we want to have clear operating lanes, defined systems ownership, and disciplined governance, which allows the business partnership to function effectively, and that allows home life to also function very effectively.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That's almost always my favorite part, when people say, I had no idea you guys were married. That means, you know, we maintained a level of professionalism in the company that is not just akin to being married. And I think when that type of structure is in place, honestly, the company benefits from faster decisions, lower risk, and more consistent execution across the entire system. I'm Dr. Abhishek Nagaraj.
I'm Dr. Anushka Gaglani. Thank you for joining us on this episode, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching this episode of Filling You In, where we uncover the insights, trends, and stories shaping the dental industry. If you like this podcast, please share it on your social channels and visit Areo Dental Group on LinkedIn or on Instagram at Areo Dental Group. You can also subscribe to the series and check out all of our episodes on this YouTube channel or at areodental.com/podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and let's keep elevating the dental field together.